Hi, I'm going to continue in this anthology, and this is, I have a video on Ruth Benedict. She's a anthropologist, and she did a critique of ethical, moral objectivism, given some statistics of certain cultures, and she gives a pretty good argument. She kind of gives some things that happen between cultures, and shows how she gives a sort of dependency thesis where the moral rights and wrongs depend on the society or the culture. But this video is about. This is a part of this anthology, which is Louis Pojman, a critique of ethical relativism. Now, I'm pretty much neither an ethical relativist nor am I an ethical objectivist. I would say, I view some things as ethically objective, but I do not ascribe myself to moral absolutism, nor to moral realism. But I would say it's difficult to say where I am, or where I stand meta-ethically speaking, because it's kind of a virtue theory a little bit, but it's more based on the phenomenological ethics of Werner Marx, which I've done a couple of videos about. But anyway, this is going to go in a few different stages. First, Pojman goes through an analysis of ethical relativism. He goes through three different principles of it, and analyzes that, and then he discusses moral subjectivism, and then he critiques it itself, and then he gives his case for moral objectivism. But anyway, firstly, he examines the thesis contained in John Ladd's succinct statement on ethical conventional relativism, and first, there's three different principles here. One, moral rightness and wrongness of actions vary from society to society, so there are no universal moral standards held by all societies. This is known as the diversity thesis. Two, whether or not it is right for individuals to act in a certain way depends on, or is relative to the society in which they belong. The dependency thesis. Three, therefore, there are no absolute or objective moral standards that apply to all people everywhere. That is the thesis of ethical relativism. The first thesis, which may be called the diversity thesis, is simply a description that acknowledges the fact that moral rules differ from society to society. Eskimos allow their elderly to die by starvation, whereas we believe that this is morally wrong. The Spartans of ancient Greece and the Dobu of New Guinea believe that stealing is morally right, but we believe it is wrong. A tribe in East Africa once threw deformed infants to the hippopotamuses, but we abhor infanticide. Ruth Benedict describes a tribe in Melanesia that views cooperation and kindness as vices, whereas we see them as virtues. So he goes over a few different things here that, like the Eskimos allowing the elderly to die by starvation. That is not something anybody, like most people here, would not view that as morally right. But that in that culture, in that society, that is more morally right. Same thing with infanticide, with giving the infants to the hippopotamuses. That's also something that we would not do if there was hippos around here. We would not throw the infants to them. deformed or not. Anyway. There may or may not be moral principles held in common by every society, but if there are any, they seem to be few at best. Certainly, it would be very difficult to derive a single true morality by observing various societies' moral standards. So he says here that by looking at various societies' moral standards, we're not going to really get any moral truth out of it. Nevertheless, as Hume pointed out long ago, the fact that different cultures had different practices no more refutes ethical objectivism than the fact that water flows in different directions in different places refutes the law of gravity. So, this statement of diversity does not refute anything. So, too, the second thesis, the dependency thesis, asserts that individual acts are right or wrong depending on the nature of the society from which they emanate. Morality does not occur in a vacuum. He says this a few times in this essay. And what is considered morally right or wrong must be seen in a context that depends on the goals, wants, and beliefs, history, and environment of the society in question. William G. Sumner says, "We learn morals as unconsciously as we learn to walk and hear and breathe, and we never know any reason why the morals are what they are. The justification of them is that when we wake to consciousness of life, we find them facts which already hold us in bonds of tradition, custom, and habit. Trying to see things from an independent, non-cultural point of view would be like taking out our eyes in order to examine their contours and qualities. There's no innocent eye. We are simply culturally determined beings." So, then, Pojman gives two theses of dependency, the weak and the strong. We could, of course, distinguish between a weak and a strong thesis of dependency. For the non-relativists can accept a certain degree of relativity in the way moral principles are applied in various cultures depending on beliefs, history, and environment. For example, Asians show respect by covering the head and uncovering the feet, whereas Westerners do the opposite. Both sides adhere to a principle of respect, but apply it differently. But the ethical relativist must maintain a stronger thesis, one that insists that the moral principles themselves are products of the cultures and may vary from society to society. The ethical relativist contends that even beyond environmental factors and differences in beliefs, a fundamental disagreement exists among societies. One way for the relativist to support this thesis is by appealing to an indeterminacy of translation thesis, which maintains that there is a conceptual relativity among language groups so that we cannot even translate into our language the worldviews of a culture with a radically different language. And then he states that ethical relativists want to be conventional about it. The conclusion that there are no absolute or objective moral standards, the third one, binding on all people, follows from the first two propositions. Combining cultural relativism, the diversity thesis, with the dependency thesis, yields ethical relativism in the classic form. If there are different moral principles from culture to culture, and if all morality is rooted in culture, then it follows there are no universal moral principles that are valid or true for all cultures and peoples at all times. So, he then discusses the two different kinds of supposed ethical relativism. And he's going to say this, he's going to discuss ethical subjectivism and ethical conventional relativism or conventionalism. And he's going to show how conventionalism can be reduced easily to subjectivism. And here he discusses how subjectivism is really bad and it's incoherent. This is the idea of ethical subjectivism. Morality is in the eye of the beholder. They treat morality like taste or aesthetic judgments, person relative. This form of moral subjectivism has sorry consequence, makes morality a very useless concept for on its premises. Little or no interpersonal criticism or judgment is logically possible. Suppose that you are repulsed by observing John torturing a child. You cannot condemn him if one of his principles is torture little children for the fun of it. The only basis for judging him wrong might be that he was a hypocrite who condemned others for torturing. But suppose that another of his principles is that hypocrisy is morally permissible for him, so that we cannot condemn him for condemning others for doing what he does. So it's moral subjectivism, moral solipsism. So if John wants to torture little kids for fun, and he has in his set of morals torture little kids for fun, and just because I have a different set of morals doesn't mean I can judge him or condemn him or say that he's perverse or whatever, or heinous, whatever. I cannot do that, because if we're living under this idea of subjectivism, we cannot condemn anyone else. And then Pojman gives us a little, quite a large paragraph that's said on tape recorded by Ted Bundy. He's talking to one of his victims and justifying his murder. Then I learned that all moral judgments are value judgments, and that all value judgments are subjective, and that none can be proved by either right or wrong. I even read somewhere that the Chief Justice of the U.S. had written that the American Constitution expressed nothing more than a collective value judgments. Believe it or not, I figured out for myself what apparently the Chief Justice couldn't figure out for himself. That if the rationality of one value judgment was zero, multiplying it by millions would not make it one whit more rational. Nor is there any reason to obey the law for anyone, like myself, who has the boldness and daring, the strength of character, to throw off its shackles. I discovered that to become truly free, truly unfettered, I had become truly uninhibited. And I quickly discovered that the greatest obstacle to my freedom, the greatest block and limitation to it, consists in the insupportable value judgment that I was bound to respect the rights of others. I asked myself, who are these others, other human beings with human rights? Why is it more wrong to kill a human animal than any other animal, a pig or a sheep or a steer? Is your life more to you than a hog's life to a hog? Why should I be willing to sacrifice my pleasure more for the one than for the other? Surely you would not, in this age of scientific enlightenment, declare that God or nature has marked some pleasures as moral or good, and others as immoral or bad. In any case, let me assure you, my dear young lady, that there is absolutely no comparison between the pleasure I might take in eating ham and the pleasure I might anticipate in raping and murdering you. That is the honest conclusion to which my education has led me, after the most conscientious examination of my spontaneous and uninhibited self. So that's literally what's there. That shows what moral subjectivism is in a person. So, then Pojman argues what absurd things come from this. Absurd consequences follow from subjectivism. If it is correct that the morality reduces to aesthetic tastes about which there can be neither argument nor interpersonal judgment. Although many students say they espouse subjectivism, there is evidence that it conflicts with other of their moral views. They typically condemn Hitler as an evil man for his genocidal policies. So, this, like, people say that often, that I'm a moral subjectivist, but yet they look at Hitler or Ted Bundy or somebody like that and say, yeah, that's wrong. So, and then he discusses how this would go down to a Hobbesian state of nature. What else? So subjectivism treats individuals like billiard balls on a societal pool table where they meet only in radical collisions, each aimed at his or her own goal, striving to do in the others, before they themselves are done in. This atomistic view of personality is belied by the fact that we develop in families and mutually dependent communities in which we share a common language, common institutions, and similar rituals and habits, and that we often feel one another's joys and sorrows. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent. Radical individualistic ethical relativism is incoherent. If so, it follows that the only possible view of ethical relativism must be one that grounds morality in the group or culture, which is conventionalism. So, this shows, obviously, that ethical subjectivism is not coherent, and you cannot argue this without leading to absurdities. Like if you're gonna argue this, how can this be applied without? Because basically, each person is gonna have value judgments they're gonna have hedonistic value judgments, and they're gonna move towards what they want, or whatever desires they have, or whatever pleasures they want to fulfill. So that is shown there as incoherent, especially with the little spiel by Ted Bundy. That is one instance of what could happen. That's one instance of what, if that's one instance of a moral subjectivist, a true one. So, conventionalism. Conventional ethical relativism, the view that there are no objective moral principles, but that all valid moral principles are justified by virtue of their cultural acceptance, recognizes the social nature of morality. Okay. Now, the two people that hold this view is Ruth Benedict and Melville Herskovits. This, leads to something that is ethical tolerance, and it's a weapon against ethnocentrism. Ethnocentricity being is discrimination between cultures and societies. This conventional cultural relativism is they look at it as a way to bring about intolerance. And these four premises are of Herskovits. One, if morality is relative to its culture, then there is no independent basis for criticizing the morality of any other culture but one's own. Two, if there is no independent way of criticizing any other culture, we ought to be tolerant of the moralities of other cultures. Morality is relative to its culture. Number three. Therefore, four, we ought to be tolerant of the moralities of other cultures. So, here's the issue with this idea of tolerance. In deep seated in this thing here is an obligation to be tolerant of other cultures. If there's no independent way of criticizing any other culture, we ought to be tolerant of the moralities of other cultures. Morality is relative to its culture number three. So, tolerance is certainly a virtue, but is this a good argument for it? I think not. Pojman says, if morality is simply relative to each culture, then if the culture in question does not have a principle of tolerance, its members have no obligation to be tolerant. Rescovitz seems to be treating the principle of tolerance as the one exception to his relativism. He seems to be treating it as an absolute moral principle. But from a relativistic point of view, there is no more reason to be tolerant than to be intolerant, and neither stance is objectively moral, better than the other. So, and on this account, there's no reason to be tolerant at all. And then he says, unless we have an independent moral basis for law, it is hard to see why we have any general duty to obey it. So he not only discusses this tolerance, this idea of tolerance, he also goes into ideas about the law. He's giving disturbing consequences of it. It seems to entail that reformers are always morally wrong since they go against the tide of cultural standards. William Wilberforce was wrong in the 18th century to oppose slavery. The British were immoral to oppose sati. I've heard it pronounced sati. Which is the burning of widows. I've heard it pronounced sati. So here he puts it S-U-T-E-E. I've heard it. I've seen it S-A-T-I. So I guess it's the same. The early Christians were wrong in refusing to serve in the Roman army or bow down to Caesar, since the majority in the Roman Empire believed that these two acts were moral duties. Jesus himself was immoral in breaking the law of his day by healing on the Sabbath day and by advocating the principles of the Sermon on the Mount, since it is clear that few in his time or in ours accepted them. So this is saying that people who are reforming or changing society, they're wrong too, because it's like if this was the way it always was, this conventional ethical relativism, all of this would be wrong. All the reform that has taken place since humans, it would be wrong. So and then he moves on to law. Our normal view is that we have a prima facie duty to obey the law, because law in general promotes the human good. According to most objective systems, this obligation is not absolute, but relative to the particular law's relation to a wider moral order. Civil disobedience is warranted in some cases where the law seems to be in serious conflict with morality. However, if moral relativism is true, then neither law nor civil disobedience has a firm foundation. On the one hand, from the side of the society at large, civil disobedience will be morally wrong as long as the majority culture agrees with the law in question. On the other hand, if you belong to the relevant subculture that doesn't recognize the particular law in question because it is unjust from your point of view, disobedience will be morally mandated. The Ku Klux Klan, which believes that Jews, Catholics, and blacks are evil or undeserving of high regard, are given conventionalism, morally permitted or required to break the laws that protect these endangered groups. Why should I obey a law that my group do? Justify our acts of civil disobedience against unjust laws. Both the validity of law and morally motivated disobedience of unjust laws are null in favor of a power struggle. So there's a few problems he's drawn out here. One of the problems is this idea of tolerance, which cannot be brought in because there's no this cultural ethical this conventional ethical relativism has no place for moral absolutes. There's no place for it at all, and then yet Herskovitz, he's going to put this obligation for, or this principle of tolerance, which he says is obligated. But how does that work when you are in a moral theory of cultural, of conventional ethical relativism? There's just no room for it, and that would be, and if he was going to have one obligation, it would be that. But then Pojman states more problems with having one moral absolute among a theory of conventional relativism. And then he discusses the problems with reformers. And then he discusses the problems of law. And then there's another. The problem is that the notion of a culture or society is notoriously difficult to define. This is especially so in a pluralistic society like our own, where the notion seems to be vague with unclear boundary lines. One person may belong to several societies, subcultures, with different value emphases and arrangements of principles. So, a person may belong to a nation, to the nation as a single society within certain values of patriotism, honor, courage, and laws, including some that are controversial but have majority acceptance, such as the current law on abortion. But he or she may also belong to a church that opposes some of the laws of the state. So you can see where there's no boundaries. There's no boundaries to enforce that. And then he says, perhaps the relativist would adhere to a principle which says that in such cases, the individual may choose which groups to belong to as primary. If Mary chooses to have an abortion, she is choosing to belong to the general society relative to the principle. And John must likewise choose among groups. John, the KKK guy. The trouble with this option is that it seems to lead back to counterintuitive results. If Murder Mike of Murder Incorporated feels like killing bank manager Orcutt and wants to feel good about it, he identifies with the Murder Incorporated society rather than the general public morality. Does this justify the killing? In fact, couldn't one justify anything by simply forming a small subculture approved of it? Ted Bundy would be morally pure in raping and killing innocents simply by virtue of forming a little coterie. How large must the group be in order to be a legitimate subculture or society? Does it need 10 or 15 people? How about just 3? Come to think about it, why can't my burglary partner and I found our own society with a morality of its own? Of course, if my partner dies, I can still claim that I was acting from an originally social set of norms. But why can't I dispense with the interpersonal agreements altogether and invent my own morality? Since morality on this view is only an invention anyway. Conventional relativism seems to reduce to subjectivism, and subjectivism leads, as we have seen, to moral solipsism, to the demise of morality altogether. So, with that, he gives all these problems with conventional relativism, pretty much. He discusses the tolerance thing, the reformist thing, the law thing, and the boundary thing, the boundary between cultures and subcultures and societies. And then with that, he says, should one object that this is an instance? So there's a lot here, and then he should one object that this is an instance of the slippery slope fallacy. Let that person give an alternative analysis of what constitutes a viable social basis for generating valid or true moral principles. Perhaps we might agree, for the sake of the argument at least, that the very nature of morality entails two people making an agreement. This move saves the conventionalist moral from moral solipsism because it still permits about almost any principle at all to count as moral. And what's more, those principles can be thrown out, and their contraries substituted for them as the need arises. If two or three people decide that they will make cheating on exams morally acceptable for themselves via forming a fraternity, Cheaters Anonymous, at their university, then cheating becomes moral. Why not? Why not rape as well? So, yeah. This is, and then, like, this is basically showing that, even, with these possible things trying to save it, it's gonna still move from conventional relativism to moral solipsism and the demise of morality. So then he goes on to critique ethical relativism. He says the demise of morality, given this, this falling from conventional relativism to moral solipsism, is not enough to reject relativism. So then he gives out these three theses again: the diversity thesis, the dependency thesis, and the thesis of ethical relativism. Does any one of these seem problematic? So let's think about this first principle, the diversity thesis. What is considered morally right and wrong varies from society to society, so that there are no moral principles accepted by all societies. Pojman says that this first premise doesn't by itself imply ethical relativism, and then the denial of it doesn't disprove it either. So he goes to the dependency thesis. Morality does not occur in a vacuum, but rather what is considered morally right or wrong must be seen in a context depending on the goals, wants, beliefs, history, and environment of the society in question. We distinguish a weak and strong thesis of dependency. The weak thesis says that the application of principles depends on particular cultural predicament. Whereas the strong thesis affirms that the principles themselves depend on that predicament. The non-relativist can accept a certain relativity in the way moral principles are applied in various cultures depending on beliefs, history, and environment. For example, a raw environment with scarce natural resources may justify the Eskimos' brand of euthanasia to the objectivists who in another environment would consistently reject that practice. The members of the tribe of the Sudan throw their deformed children into the river because of their belief that such infants belong to the hippopotamus, god of the river. We believe that they have a false belief about this, but the point is that the same principles of respect for property and respect for human life are operative in these contrary practices. They differ with us only in belief, not in substantive moral principle. This is an illustration of how non-moral beliefs, when applied to common moral principles, generate different actions in different cultures. In our own culture, the difference in the non-moral belief about the status of a fetus generates opposite moral prescriptions. The major difference between pro-choicers and pro-choicers and pro-lifers is not whether we should kill people, but whether fetuses are really people. It is a debate about facts of the matter, not the principle of killing innocent people. So the fact that moral principles are weakly dependent doesn't show that ethical relativism is valid. In spite of this weak dependency on non-moral factors, that it could still be a set of general moral norms applicable to all cultures, and even recognized in most, which are disregarded in cultures of own expense. So, essentially, what's being said here is that many relativists embrace relativism as a default position. Objectivism makes no sense to them. I think this is Pojman thinks this is and Harman's position, as the latter's quotation at the beginning of this article seems to indicate. Objectivism has in supper real problems, so the answer must be relativism. The only positive argument I know for the strong dependency thesis upon which ethical relativism rests is that the indeterminacy of translation thesis. This theory, set forth by B.L. Worf and W.B. Quine, holds that languages are often fundamentally different from each other, that we cannot accurately translate concepts from one to another. But this thesis, while relatively true even within a language, seems falsified by experience. We do learn foreign languages and learn to translate across linguistic frameworks. For example, people from a myriad of language groups come to the U.S. and learn English and communicate perfectly well. Rather than a complete hiatus, the interplay between these other cultures eventually enriches the English language with new concepts, even as English has enriched or corrupted the French, as the French might argue, other languages. Even if it turns out that there is some basic indeterminacy of translation between language users, we should not infer from this that no translation or communication is possible. It seems reasonable to believe that general moral principles are precisely those things that can be communicated transculturally. The kind of common features that Cloquot and Wilson advance: duties of restitution and reciprocity, regulation on sexual behavior, obligations of parents to children, no unnecessary harm principle, and a sense that the good should flourish and the guilty be punished. These and others constitute a common human experience, a common set of values within a common human predicament of struggling to survive and flourish in a world of scarce resources. So it is possible to communicate cross-culturally and find that we agree on many of the important things in life. If this is so, then the indeterminacy of translation thesis upon which relativism rests must itself be relativized to the point where there is no objection, where is no objection to objective morality. So the big thing here is the thesis how concepts cannot be translated from language to language. But then, like Pojman said, English has been enriched because of concepts from other languages. So I think what he says about conventional relativism, having reduced it to moral subjectivism, and stating how those two, the first two premises don't really defeat ethical relativism, and then finally how he discusses the idea of the concept between language of the theory of Worf and Quine. I think stating how that can be proven wrong and that cross-cultural communication can exist, that I think shows the problems. It shows how we can't. There's no that there's more than what is socially accepted. It's more than just culture. It's not about dependency. It's not about diversity. And then he discusses his case for moral objectivism. And I guess what I want to look through in this part is he brings out a couple different possible sets of moral, non-overridable moral principles that ought never be violated. Now, this is Kant's, like, for example, this is Kant's categorical imperative. Now, upon these principles of the categorical imperative of Kant, you can't lie. Given it doesn't matter what the case is. By this system, there's no lying at all. No, none is morally permissible. Not at all. An objectivist need not posit any non-overridable principles, at least not in unqualified general form, and so it need not be an absolutist. So, on the objectivist account of moral principles are what William Ross refers to as prima facie principles, valid rules of action that should generally be adhered to, but may be overridden by another moral principle in cases of moral conflict. For example, when a principle of justice may generally outweigh a principle of benevolence, there are times when enormous good could be done by sacrificing a small amount of justice, so that an objectivist will be inclined to act according to the principle of benevolence. There may be some absolute or non-overridable principles, but there need not be any or many objectivism for to be true. So that's the difference there. So then there's realism. Realism is arguing that there are independent moral entities, I guess, would be a good way to describe it. Where was that? I'm trying to find it. Anyway, so those three, he states them as different. Now, one of his principles, it is morally wrong to torture people for the fun of it. And then he has 10 ones here. 1, do not kill innocent people. Do not cause unnecessary pain or suffering. Do not cheat or steal. Keep your promises and honor your contracts. Do not deprive another person of his or her freedom. Do justice, treat equals equally and unequals unequally. Tell the truth. Help other people, at least when the cost to oneself is minimal. Reciprocate and obey just laws. So these are non-overridable principles. Human nature is relatively similar in essential respects. Moral principles are functions of human needs and interests instituted by reason in order to promote the most significant interests and needs of rational beings. Some moral principles will promote human interests and meet human needs better than others. Those principles will meet essential needs and promote the most significant interests of humans in optimal ways can be said to be objectively valid moral principles. Therefore, since there is a common human nature, there is an objectively valid set of moral principles applicable to all humanity. So this is a discussion of common human nature. something that you might find in W.D. Ross, and then he discusses an explanation of the attraction to ethical relativism. One is that the options are usually presented as though absolutism and relativism are the only alternatives. So conventionalism went out against an implausible competitor. Granted, it takes a little philosophical sophistication to make the crucial distinctions, and it is precisely for the lack of this sophistication or reflection that relativism has procured its enormous prestige. Second reason for an inclination towards ethical relativism is the confusion of moral objectivism with moral realism. A realist is a person who holds that moral values have independent existence, if only as emergent properties. But objectivism is compatible with either of these views, realism or anti-realism. All it calls for is deep intersubjective agreement among humans due to a common nature and common goals and needs. And then he talks about J.L. Mackie, which is a moral nihilist, anti-realist. Subjective agreement would give intersubjective values, but intersubjectivity is not objectivity. But Mackie fails to note that there are two kinds of intersubjectivity, and that one of them gives all that the objectivist wants for the moral theory. Third is that our recent sensitivity to cultural relativism and the evils of ethnocentrism, which have plagued the relations of Europeans and Americans with those of other cultures, has made us conscious of the frailty of many aspects of our moral repertoire, so that there's a tendency to wonder who's to judge really what's wrong or right. Fourth, decline of religion in Western society. So essentially, I wanted to do this video because I want to look at the difference between relativism and objectivism. Absolutism and realism are different things. I think should be touched on in different lights. But ethical relativism is something that people move to because they don't. I think they don't always see that there are some, not necessarily they often see the alternative to relativism as absolutism. And it's not necessarily true that principles that are like actual moral principles that these moral principles that if you were to ascribe to them that they don't have to be non-overridable. They don't have to be absolutes. They don't have to be categorical imperative type principles. And also that there's more theories. There's more ethical, normative, and meta-ethical theories to argue than just relativism, absolutism, objectivism, realism. There's different meta-ethical theories. There's different normative ethical theories that you can just look through, and there's different things to look at. There's different ways of going about how morality is in our lives than just relativism or absolutism. There's not just two. There's more than that. But I want to think about his idea of objectivism. Objectivism I think, is one way out of many to go against relativism. Relativism is kind of like it's very convincing, also because of how a sociologist or an anthropologist can go look at things like how a certain culture can throw deformed infants into a river for hippos, or how things change throughout the years, and how it's very interesting to look at it that way. But just because there's different morals between society to society, it doesn't mean that it's all societal. It's not. It doesn't mean it's all society reducible. Is what I'm trying to say. Even though there are things that are in many other cultures that would be abhorrent in American culture, that still means that you could go about being an objectivist, and you could go about laying down certain moral principles that would be able to fit into every single society. But in my opinion, that shouldn't be the goal that the ethicists go for. That shouldn't be what the philosophers try to do. There's better things that can be done. There's better ethical theories that can be formulated. Because if you're a moral if you're a moral objectivist, you're gonna be a certain way. You're gonna be a certain way in normative ethics. But then I think there's a couple good ways to fix this rift between relativism and absolutism, or even relativism versus objectivism. In that, I think for meta-ethics, I think that would be emotivism. I think that emotivism is a meta-ethical theory which states that statements of morality are not bivalent, but they are statements of emotion. And furthermore, I state, I think that anything that should ever be done in normative ethics should be based somewhat off of emotion. I think that we shouldn't act off of moral principles, overridable or not. They shouldn't be off of moral principles that we guide ourselves by, but more by emotion and how we feel towards people, more like empathy and compassion and attunement. And that's mostly from Werner Marx. I think that's the book towards phenomenological ethics. He's kind of moving towards a non-metaphysical ethics, and that's how he does it through phenomenology. I think that's what he says in that book, compared with the Cartesian Meditations by Edmund Husserl. I think those two books could do all the work for normative ethics. But that's just where I'm at. So I think it was good to look at this, because it shows here. First of all, it shows here very, very, very well that ethical relativism is not necessarily false, but unconvincing. There'd be a lot of work that would have to be done to keep it up, and to keep conventional relativism to not move to subjectivism and solipsism, because that's basically what it does. I mean, Pojman showed that. So that's all. If you have any questions, please comment below or email me or something. So, yeah.